Well, this is another Monday morning. I just wanted to hit you guys with some more random items of interest. Nothing earth-shaking, but I have noticed some funny stuff over the years and recently. But one of the things that I ran into whenever I had a student that was rebuilding a transmission on a Dodge Dakota was he managed, and this I actually illustrated this with a torque converter part that I had, but he actually had this needle bearing he put in there upside down. You see the wrong versus the right on that. If you put this in here upside down like that, it is going to come all to pieces. And this one came all to pieces, and it filled with particles of metal all through the transmission and got all the valves sticking, and he had to tear it all the way back down because whenever he puts that, every little detail building an automatic transmission is important, and anybody that's ever built one knows that. And this thing right here was put in upside down. It turned into a big problem. He worked and worked and worked on that thing trying to get it straightened out after that, and we almost never got it to go into fourth gear again. But I just pay attention to that. I took as good a picture as I could of that, even though, once again, this is a torque converter stator, which also has a bearing like this. So I just wanted to make sure that I illustrated the right way to put that in there, and I showed this to my students when I was teaching automatic transmissions. Now this is a little graph of interest here. You might notice that the most significant contributor to greenhouse gas effect is water vapor. Now if you look at CO2, you're looking at 0.117%. And the green part is what's man-made. So a tiny, tiny little percent of water vapor, 0.001%, is man-made. The rest of it's natural. CO2 comes in a distant second, but only 0.117% of CO2 is man-made. See, so how much is it going to change? Methane, 0.0666%. These numbers are how much is man-made. 0.047% of N2O, and then miscellaneous gases. All of this stuff that they're talking about as a greenhouse, you can't shoot down the clouds, you can't do away with water vapor. And there was a big volcano that erupted about late last year that it put so much, it was an undersea volcano, and it put so much water vapor in the air that it'll be up there for decades. And so this thing's out of our hands anyway. But there's a lot more going on than what they're telling you as far as their plan. Now, the transfer case jobs are always kind of fun, and I had a transfer case or two that I would have my students disassemble and reassemble, and it had to work when they got through with it. You know, they had to show me that it worked in all of its positions and all, low and high and all that. And some of these I've mentioned this before, you can get a kit to redo your transfer case that includes this part right here, the chain and that case right there, because when that chain starts to stretch, and it's basically made like an old-fashioned timing chain on a lot of these, and it'll start rubbing against the inside of that case, and it'll rub a hole in it. Well, one time, and I've mentioned that before, we got a transfer case that we were replacing because it had rubbed a hole like that, and we didn't have the time to, get the parts and replace it and all that, and order them to wait for it because it was getting close to the end of the term. What we did was, whenever LKQ sends a transfer case, they send it with no fluid in it. Okay, so we put this transfer case on, and when we put the transfer case on and filled it up with fluid, we found it was leaking between the case halves, which are basically sealed with silicone most of the time anyway. And the annoying thing about that was, after we paid for that transfer case, and it came with a leak that we didn't see because it came without fluid in it. They always drain the fluid out of everything before they ship it. So whenever we had to pull the thing back off and take it apart and reseal it and put it back on. It was a bunch of extra work, and so anyway, that was a pain. Of course, at the college we didn't charge labor anyway, but that was a little transfer case thing going on there. This was the transmission shop that we had over there. I bought these transmission workbenches. You notice they tilt from the outside in, and there's a trough for the fluid and for small parts to roll into if they get away from you. And so what we would do is I'd have the students to tear down the transmissions. That guy in the blue shirt's the maintenance man. He's just hanging out over there. But and then I had a bunch of parts on this rack right here that I would use, you know, steering gears and all that kind of stuff. But one way or another, this was the transmission job. This right here, I had the students take these assemblies here and fix them up and paint them. You know, they've got a strut and a spindle and all that, so that you know, you could actually mount that and fool around with the brakes on it if you wanted to and all that. And that's where we had the lathe for turning the brakes. We had 2 of these lathes. There's another one over here. And then I bought these shelves to store transmissions and engines on, you know, that were trainer units or whatever. And we added a lot to that. When we would swap out a transmission or an engine, we would do that. This was the other part of the shop that was across the road from, you know, the little college road from the main shop. And you don't hardly ever see any pictures that I've taken in there, so I figured I'd put that one in here. Now this right here was an interesting tool. I worked at a lot of different shops that I would find one of these things here laying on the table. All right, and the part number is a J21552. That's a Kent Moore number. And I wondered for years what that thing was supposed to be used for. And as it turned out, I stumbled across this in a shop manual online. And I said, well, I'm going to go ahead and show this. And you see this part right here. This is a power steering unit off of a Ford. And what it does is, you know, the power steering has actually helped. It actually puts fluid on one side of this and helps push it back and forth to help you with your steering. And you got a spool valve that directs the fluid and all that kind of thing. But anyway, these recirculating balls that you're seeing right here, I used to have my students take these steering gear like this apart and take all those balls out of there. Now, you don't have to have this tool to put those balls back in there. But when you stuck this thing in there and you dropped those balls in there, this thing was just the right size. In other words, it was equal. It was the same size as this right here would be, and it would keep those, or just I'm sorry, just a shade smaller, actually closer to this, and it would give those balls something to roll around. And then what you would do is you would push the, I guess you'd push the spiral shaft through there, this thing right here with the spiral cut that the ball rode in. But what we always did was we just put the balls in there without using this, because at the time I didn't even know that's what this was for. But then I discovered this, and it shows them using this, and it even shows that, it even says that's the part number, J21552. It's hard to read on this slide, but you can see what I'm talking about. And I always thought that was very interesting. But one time back in the 1980s, I was working on a Mustang, an old Mustang, like at the time it was like a 73 Mustang or whatever, like the one they used in Gone in 60 Seconds, the old movie. And I had taken the steering gear off of that, and I took it apart to reseal it. And somehow or another, when I put it back together, I didn't quite get everything adjusted right. And as soon as you'd start it up, the wheels would turn all the way to the right real hard. And I fooled with that thing, and basically I was just flying blind. There wasn't any shop manual material on how to do this. And I felt like, you know, I can take anything apart and put it back together and make it work. Well, I proved myself wrong in that case, because that one didn't work. It was a disaster. And we wound up getting another steering gear for it. But steering gear doesn't cost that much anyway. You can get one. Last time I bought a steering gear like one of these, it was like $125 rebuilt from the parts house or something. They may be hiring that now. They probably are. Now, I bought this. I had the wired chassis here, which I really fixed some cars with that at the college we did. And I figured I would get one of these wireless ones. And they come with these little transmitters, and you know, tie wrap them down there where you're wanting them to transmit. Now, the only problem with that is there's so much static and noise that's not related to the noise you're hunting. This was like $450 when I bought it, and the other one was like $150. The one with the wired mics and all. And there's a pain putting all that stuff in place, but you can find out stuff with those that you can't find out any other way, or pinpoint the noise. This one here, I was extremely disappointed in it, and I followed the instructions using it, but when you put those headphones on, you could not tell what was going on, because it was scratchy, there was static, there was interference. It was just a bad deal all the way around. I mean, there's a remote possibility that I missed some crucial step, but I don't think so. Now this was a Lincoln that we looked at the rear brakes on, and the you can see that the only thing that was left was the park brake hat, part of the rotor. They just kept driving this because they didn't necessarily have to have the back brakes to stop. And it amazes me that it didn't blow the caliper, but the caliper just kind of pinched everything together and just held there. And the disc part of this that the caliper was supposed to pinch, you can see where it used to be there, you know. Anyway, it used to be way out here like this, and now it's gone. And that Lincoln was dreadfully neglected in its maintenance and all, so that's something that we used to run into every now and then. Sometimes we would have a vehicle that would come in that hadn't been touched for years and years, and it would have about half a dozen different things that needed fixing really bad. Everything would be clogged up, and it would have, you know, and you could fix 3 or 4 problems, and it may still have another problem that showed up later, and they'd come back claiming you didn't fix it, in spite of the fact that everything you needed doing, you know, because they hadn't even opened the hood for years. But one time there was this Thunderbird that I mentioned one time before, I don't remember, I've told a lot of stories, that came in there, and there was it was stalling at stoplights, and it was one of those with the throttle body fuel injection, you know, those CFI like Ford had. And seems to me like it had one of the old EVP sensors on it, EGR valve position sensors on it, that would cause it to stall. And there was a problem with the throttle position sensor, and there was a problem with the idle speed control motor, you know, which is that one that runs out and pushes on the lever. And it seemed like it had 3 or 4 parts that were bad, and every single one of them could cause it to stall. And so I just went ahead and priced out everything, and I was going to, you know, of course, set the timing and this kind of thing. And it was like, the estimate was like $450. And you got to remember, this was back in the 1980s, I guess it was, like about 1988 or something like that. And the salesman was a big old blonde-haired boy. It looked like he belonged in the World Wrestling Federation or something. And he came out there, and he says, why is it that this thing has got to have 4 parts and all that money spent on it to fix this problem? It seems to me like you could just put one of those parts on there. Well, what he didn't realize is if you just put one part on there and it comes back, you're replacing the other one for free because you didn't fix it right the first time. He had no concept of that because he was a car salesman, and he was young enough to where he hadn't been around the block yet, or plus definitely hadn't been where we were. And so I told the guy, he says, I've sold these people 5 cars, and they're not going to be happy if you charge them $450 to fix this old Thunderbird. And I said, well, if you sold them 5 cars, you made a lot of money. Maybe you can help them with their bill. And he went, this ain't funny. Well, anyway, they okayed the bill, and I fixed it, and they were happy, and they never brought the car back for any, you know, for stalling again. So that was the whole thing, you know. But anyway, in his mind, he was protecting his customer by trying to get me to, you know, put myself on the line by only halfway fixing the car. Now, this is an interesting thing that we used to run into occasionally. Sometimes you'll see one that's low on power steering fluid, and you won't see any leaks, and you won't know where it went. In other words, you can look all you want to, and you won't see any leaks, but it'll be low on power steering fluid. And this Mark fellow that worked over here, Mark Smith, that worked close to me, he was working on one, and it was low on power steering fluid. And the shop foreman came and says, what did you do about the power steering thing? He says, well, I didn't see a leak, I just filled it with fluid. And the shop foreman says, well, where did the fluid go? He says, if it didn't leak out. He goes, well, you ever heard of evaporation? You know, the shop foreman was ticked off when he told him that. But I've seen that a few times when one would be low on power steering fluid, and I'm thinking like, what? I mean, where did this go? Now, sometimes it will sneak its way into that accordion boot on the rack. And that accordion boot will start slowly fill up with fluid, and if it keeps going into there, it'll blow that accordion boot up like a big balloon. But usually the accordion boot's not sealed good enough to keep the fluid from leaking out when it goes in there, because those accordion boots on each end of the steering rack aren't supposed to have any fluid in them. If they do have fluid in them, then the seals in the rack are leaking, so remember that too. But this is just an interesting little thing that I thought we run into every now and then, and it seems to me like I remember taking a picture of this one for that very reason. We didn't see a leak anywhere, but it was low on fluid, and it's like, where in the world did it go? You should see some. Now, this Land Rover blower this is coming out of the fuse panel over here, and it makes its way to this relay over here. The blower didn't work at all. And so what we found out was this, well, there was no power coming out of the fuse panel going to this relay. When we had fed power in here, the blower worked just like it was supposed to. And so when we got to tracking that, the fuse panel had failed on the inside because of the high current pulled by the blower. Okay, you know, there's always going to be a weak link in an electrical chain, especially if you got a high current load on it. The weak link in this Land Rover that we were working on, and I don't remember what year model it was inside the fuse panel. And rather than buy a fuse panel somewhere and pay huge gigantic bucks for it, we just got a fused feed that we went straight from the battery, you know, one of the junction posts out there by the battery, you know, on the fuse panel, and came right in through the grommet into the inside of the vehicle. And we fed this relay right here. Basically, you know, we went straight from the battery through a fuse, and then we came on here and we fed right into that relay. And so the relay was only going to close whenever the fan was supposed to be on anyway, so having power there all the time didn't matter. But we bypassed this weak thing. See, if we'd got another fuse panel, we'd have been looking at the same thing sometime later. And so this right here was a good fix, and it also had a fuse out there. So we showed the, and it's right there close to the battery, so we showed the owner of the vehicle what we had done. We used nice, you know, heavy wire, I think it was 12 gauge or whatever, to go out there and to feed the relay and all that. And he ran it through loom and made sure it looked real factory and all that kind of stuff. That was something we did at the program I taught in Geneva when I started that new dual enrollment high school program over there. Some people just keep on driving after they put the spare on here. Now they did do something right here. I don't know if the left rear tire was the one that went flat, but if you're changing a tire and you're going to put a donut on it, it's best not to put the donut on the front, on a front wheel drive Asian car, because if that little donut and the regular size wheel are rolling at the same time, if you want straight down the road, the spider gears in the differential are just raising Cain in there. As a matter of fact, on some of the Hondas, I think it is, or some of those other cars, they'll tell you not to put that donut on the front. Now, the silly thing that they didn't do was they didn't make the donut the same size as the other tire, and I'm talking about diameter. Cadillac did that on at least some of their vehicles. They had a sort of a donut tire, but it was the same diameter as the tire on the opposing side. But what I always teach was, and what I always tell, you know, DIY people, because I write for carparts.com, is that if you got to change a tire and the flat's on the front, you need to put the tire from the back on that side on the front and then put the donut on the back. That's what they did here, but they kept driving until the donut went flat, and now they're kind of in a pickle. And so anyway, so be it. I talked last week about these one-piece EGR assembly. This is one of my girl students. You can see her green painted fingernails. We had to change this on a Crown Victoria, as I remember, and you can see that it's got the vacuum regulator here, and they got the sensor here, and then you got the diaphragm here, and then there's a pintle down in there that, you know, lets the EGR flow in there. And you notice also that the EGR is delivered usually, they go out of their way to make sure every cylinder gets the same amount of EGR. Like it'll usually be right behind the throttle body where it goes in there, so it's evenly spread between the cylinders through the plenum. Sometimes they'll have a separate little port in each plenum runner. Those kind of like to get stopped up, and the ones that don't stop up are cylinders that will misfire whenever the EGR is flowing. Anyway, so this right here is a messy looking business, but it's something that has to be done sometimes. You just got to pull the steering column out sometimes, and it's no fun. But words to the wise, if you're going to do this, make doggone sure that you lock the steering wheel in the center to make sure that whenever you put it back in there, you don't destroy the airbag clock spring. One of my students took on his personal car, he replaced the steering rack, and somehow or another he had the steering wheel over all the way to one side when he put the steering rack on, and the steering rack was in other words, he had the clock spring wound all the way up in one direction, and when he put the steering rack on, it was in the center, and so he just hooked the steering column back up, and the first time he turned the wheels, he destroyed the clock spring, and the clock spring for that Honda was like $450 at the time, and he did that to himself. You know, the clock spring, the power to the horn, and the airbag, and all that kind of stuff goes through there. This one guy had replaced an airbag himself, or no, I'm sorry, he replaced an ignition switch or something, or ignition lock cylinder on his little GM car. So thinking about airbags, and whenever he put it back together, he managed to pinch a wire, and as soon as he turned on the key and that airbag module sent power up there to check that airbag, you know, it's got a loop, it sends through that deployment loop back to the module to see if that loop is complete, so it can throw a code if it's not. Well, he had grounded the other wire, and as soon as that came up there, it blew that airbag up in his face, and he had a big raspberry on the side of his head. So he had to get an airbag and all that. But that's, some of your DIY people don't know the finer points of what needs to be done, and they really cause themselves some serious problems. This right here is the good old days, back when we used to work on these V8 engines, you know, in the big block. And this right here, this guy here that draws these is really, really good at drawing cutaways, and he knows his stuff. I just love looking at his pictures. I think his last name is Kimball, K-I-M-B-L-E. But you notice this one's got headers on it. And the cool thing about headers is you don't have interference from this cylinder going back into this one like you do for a manifold, because you have a collector down here. And so what that does is whenever the exhaust comes out of that cylinder, it goes into that collector, and it creates low pressure in that collector that actually, some people call this extractor exhaust, because it draws the exhaust out of all these other cylinders into that collector, and that kind of thing. So, you know, this one right here, you notice, got that fuel pump on the side, you know, on those 350s and stuff, how much fun it was to have that fuel pump rod that, you know, would fall down, and there's tricks to put that back in there and all that. I helped some people at a motel one time that were trying to put a fuel pump on their Chevy pickup, and they were having a horrible time out there, and so I got down on the ground and helped them with that. This right here was a small town deep south car show that I saw last Saturday. I was on the way to a funeral, and when I was going through this little town, this is actually Hartford, Alabama is the name of the town, but it was on the town square, and these people had all their old cars out there with the hoods open and, you know, doing the show. This one guy that lived next door to me had an old World War II Jeep ambulance that he had bought from Army surplus. You know, they had cut it in half, and he welded it back together and fixed all the wires and that kind of thing. He got that thing running again. And whenever he took that thing to a car show and opened the hood on it, everybody would swarm over there to look at that. And one day this guy that had a Camaro that was sitting next to his, everybody ignored the guy's Camaro and went to look at that old Jeep. And the guy that was driving the Camaro got mad at this guy because they were more interested in his World War II Army ambulance Jeep than they were, you know, the one that he had. Now this right here is before and after the ground fix that I did on a Bronco 2. You see the ragged oxygen sensor. Here's a ragged, ugly oxygen sensor here. Matter of fact, sometimes it would be, the oxygen sensor would be, down here you notice, this was on the service bay diagnostic system that Ford had. That was my best friend for about 10 years. The yellow, see, it would basically give you the color of each trace that you got there. And this was pretty cool because you could connect this between the engine controller and the harness, and it could read each pin separately, including your grounds and everything else. It's one of the handiest machines I've ever seen. The Sun Dynamic Data Collector I had was very similar to this in the way that it was set up. But this was pretty darn cool. And what we had to start with was we had this crappy ground connection right here. And one of these grounds is the main computer ground. And whenever I soldered a terminal on there and put the terminals in there like that, you can see the difference between this and this is like night and day. And so when I saw a ragged, ugly oxygen, so look at the range this thing's going through. From -2 to 0.3, that's not acceptable. That's hogwash. And this one right here looks more like an oxygen sensor is supposed to look. It was going from just above 0 to just below, you know, about 0.8 of a volt. And so that was really handy there. Of course, you know, you can see these other traces and stuff too if you want to fool with that. But that's what I wanted to illustrate. A ground is a lot more important than a lot of people think it is. And so, anyway. Now this right here, these are redundant potentiometers on my Explorer. This is using my Zurich scan tool, the tablet that I bought from Harbor Freight because it was only $1,000. And it's pretty darn handy. It's got some good features on it. I've talked about it before. But you notice the blue is accelerator pedal position sensor 1. And it's this bouncing around the 4-volt range when it's at rest. All right, sensor 3 is the green one. And you notice it's got a different voltage level. And sensor 2 is this brown one. And you notice these two follow each other, and this one mirrors the other two. And so these redundant sensors are there to make sure that everything is accurate that you're getting from the accelerator pedal sensor. They've also got redundant ones on the throttle body for throttle position, which is actually driven by the motor in the throttle body. And so it's a sort of a military way of doing things. They want it redundant so that you always have good, accurate readings, and so that it doesn't, the accelerator doesn't go crazy and run away and, you know, cause you to crash and burn. This was a surprise on a 99 Buick Roadmaster Ultra. I told the boy to change out this idler. It's right there in the front, easy to get to, and he said, this thing's so tight, I've never seen anything like this. And when he went to trying to take it out of there, he stripped the threads because this bolt that was holding that idler on that 99 Park Avenue Ultra, which is a supercharged engine, was left-hand thread. There was nothing in any shop manual I could find that said this was left-hand thread. Well, and there was no reason for it to be left-hand thread because the pulley was turning to the right, which technically would loosen it up if it was left-hand thread. Why they made it left-hand thread is a total mystery to me. We went ahead and just drilled that out, put a 10 millimeter 1.5 thread pitch helicoil in there, put a regular bolt with a big washer, took care of the problem. But not knowing the bolt was left-hand thread, the kid just thought it was really tight and he kept working on it. And who would have thought to spin that thing to the right anyway? It doesn't make any sense. This was when I was teaching power door lock principles. I put a power door lock actuator. This is like from an 03 Crown Vic. It was a new one I had, cost about $100. A couple of cheap relays, a couple of cheap buttons from Radio Shack, made it so they could connect these wires, and whenever they mashed this button it would go out, when they mashed the other one it'd come back in. And they understood the way these, whenever power door locks use relays, that's how they work. And it was really handy to teach that. When I build a trainer board like this out of that little piece of plexiglass with those screws and everything, it costs very little money. If you buy a trainer board that's built by some of these companies, you're going to pay thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars for something that won't teach you as much. This was the last slide before my closing slide. I noticed this is one of my neighbors, and I don't know what he's doing here, but this was April 24th, 2023. This was May 1st. That car is still sitting out there, by the way. And I'm keeping on watching it. It's an Acura. What he's doing to it, I don't know, but he's really slow about getting it done. This was driving me nuts. If I got one jacked up with the wheels off, I'm going to do everything I can to get it fixed, to get the wheels back on it and torqued and get that thing back on the road. But this is one of those sagas. You notice nothing has really changed except the date. The jack's even pretty much in the same place, although the jack was under here. He may be replacing the struts. I'm not sure. I'm still trying to figure out what he's doing. I hadn't asked him about it. Well, have a great week. And hey, let's be careful out there.